I've got it set up, don't worry.
It's going.
I've got a bit of a leash here, so I can't wander too far, which is probably a good thing. Let's get this going. Perfect. All right, so as I graduated from college a few years ago, like one of the things I miss the most about it is pop quizzes. So I get to give them now. So, terrorism versus gun violence from 2005 to 2015. So how many people you think died from terrorism in that time span? Any guesses?
You mean the United States?
Yeah, the United States.
20? 10?
All right. Now, how many do you think died from gun violence?
A lot more. In
Tons more.
75.
So, 71 Americans were killed in terrorist attacks on U.S. soil from 2005 to 2015. And there's 302,000 were killed by gun violence in the same period. Now, what percent of gun deaths come from mass shootings? Any guesses?
Less than 1%.
Less than 1%? All right. So it's actually around 2%, but you're in the ballpark here. It's a very small percentage of the overall gun deaths, yet has a very large media presence. So it's just important to know that while mass shootings are definitely important to cover, it's a small slice of the overall problem. And then if you're here, I guess, 2 years ago, you don't get to guess on this one. Which takes longer in Oklahoma? Getting a yellow belt in Taekwondo or becoming a firearms instructor in Oklahoma? Yeah, so it's the Taekwondo, which comes in respectively at 72 hours. For the firearms instructor, it's 16 hours. And it actually sounded pretty long to me. So I contacted the firearm instructor who's based in Massachusetts, and I was like, hey, is this number correct? He's like, yeah, but they're probably counting in the amount of time it takes you to get the concealed carry permit beforehand. And all the additional coursework is to become an instructor is to be able to read from the manual and then a slightly higher percent of hitting the target. And that's basically it. So in 16 hours, you could be a firearms instructor.
Oh, I think I'll do that.
Yeah, it could be fun. So, with the pop quiz out of the way,
Maybe some alternate facts.
a little bit about me before continuing on. So I was a finance and risk management graduate at the University of Oklahoma, graduated in 2014, which seems like forever ago by now. Especially this past month, which seems like about a decade. I have a CFA charter, which basically means I passed three very hard finance tests. And I'm the founder of Hughes Capital Management, LLC, which is a registered investment advisor. So if you have money questions, you can ask me. Free commercial there. And then I got into the gun violence prevention business right after Sandy Hook. It motivated me to start researching the issue, and the more I researched, well, kind of the angrier I got about all the misinformation out there and how little our politicians were doing to stop the crisis. So I started writing about it, and I founded Armed with Reason with my best friend, who's a much better writer than I am, so I put a lot of the work on him. And so we've been published in all sorts of national outlets since then. So I do know a bit about what I'm talking about here. So with that, let's jump straight into the numbers. So the best states versus Oklahoma. So what do the best states when it comes to gun violence, meaning they have the lowest gun-related deaths, all have in common? Is a permit required to purchase a handgun? Mostly yes. Universal background checks? Yes. Handguns registered? 50-50. Stand your ground? None of them. How difficult to obtain a concealed carry permit? Quite difficult. Open carry permit? Either difficult or moderate. And then waiting period for handguns? On some of them, yes. Now let's look at Oklahoma. Notice how much higher our gun death rate is. This is including both homicides, suicides, accidents, all that. No, 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 no. Yes, easy. At least we make it moderately difficult to get an open carry permit, because in some states, you don't have to have a permit at all. And then there's no waiting period for handguns. So across the board, our gun laws suck. And shows it a bit better here. The Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, I think they merged with another group just recently. They give us a well-deserved F when it comes to gun laws. We're about 25th on the gun law rank, which sounds high, but about half the states have a failing grade. So we're just in that group. And then our gun death rank, we're the 8th highest in the country. And if you look at who joins us, so Louisiana, Arkansas, just basically states that voted for Trump. All have higher levels of gun violence. And we're the 8th worst out of that. Fortunately, some of our neighbors are worse, but it's bad.
Is that percentage-wise or numbers?
So these are gun death rates per 100,000.
So, okay.
So we're in the 15.1 to 18
Okay.
per 100,000 range. Louisiana's in the 18.1 plus. I think they're the only one who get that coveted category. And then you can notice like much of New England is in the 3 to 6 range.
As is Hawaii.
Yes.
Hawaii down
Yeah, it's so light in Hawaii, and you can barely see it. And then if you look at it as compared to other countries, say Europe, and we're basically the same as Russia, not just in terms of president, but in terms of gun violence and overall homicides. So yes, I will be dropping Trump jokes a lot here. It's a coping mechanism. So if you notice, almost all of Western Europe has very low homicide rates overall. This is including gun homicides and other homicides. Now, one of the main arguments presented by the NRA and gun advocates is that, well, if they don't use a gun, they'll just use something else. Well, in Western Europe, they just aren't using other stuff to kill people. Now, in Russia, they both have gun violence problems and other types of violence, and so it has a lot of problems. And in the US, most of our problems stem from the gun violence.
What are the breakouts in the European countries? Are those parishes or counties or?
Yeah, I think they're I think it depends on which country it is. Like England, it's all like one mass and then into Scotland. So I guess kind of counties, but it probably depends on the state. And like Germany has a lot more than say Portugal.
See, I'm surprised in the Scandinavian countries there's that one blob
Finland.
of dark blue.
Yeah, Finland does have weaker gun laws relative to the rest of Europe. Same with Switzerland, but Switzerland doesn't show necessarily, but Switzerland's gun laws are still significantly stronger than ours. They basically have a militia-based system. But yeah, so Finland's bad. Some of the Nordic countries, yeah, I'm not quite sure what's up with that portion of Sweden, probably low population density. But yeah, so, but overall, we're worse than Western Europe and basically much like Russia, though we aren't quite as bad in terms of the violence there. And in Oklahoma, like remember us having the F rating, there's even more bad bills coming up. So Senate Bill 11, allow non-residents to obtain handgun license and online applications. Now that's not necessarily bad for us, but it is bad for people in other states where they might have tougher licensing requirements, but they recognize Oklahoma licenses, then they'll be able to get their license here and then just go about their business in whatever state that is. Utah had quite a similar thing going on for a number of years. I think they still have that where you can just get it online, no need to actually fire a gun or anything, and the quiz would be very easy. and they let so many people from other states would just get that license because it was so much easier. So kind of the same thing going on in Oklahoma. House Bill 2323, which just I heard went through committee, but it was amended to where it only applies to cars and being able to carry permitless in a car. So I'm not quite sure how that makes much of a difference now, but it was a really bad bill, and now it's less of a bad bill. But there are other ones. So like 2322 is preemption, so if a city has stricter gun laws than the state, they're not allowed to do that, and I believe this bill puts fines on those cities. So not only are you not allowed to do it, if you do it, it'll cost you like $10,000 a month or something for however long you have that bill on the books. So basically make sure that no cities can have stronger gun laws than the state. And then Senate Bill 380, guns on campus, yay. And then 1556, you can sue if injured in a gun-free zone. So basically, if you would typically carry a gun but can't carry it into a business, and then you were injured in such a way where a gun may have helped you somehow, you can then sue that business because they didn't let you carry a gun in there.
Are these organic? Are they coming out of the people or the legislators in Oklahoma, or is it the NRA pushing it?
There's one I didn't mention up here that basically doesn't allow any state money to fund anti-gun groups, which is organically by like 2 people who bully their legislators into, please put this bill. And they're like, okay. But most of these are, some versions of these are occurring across the country. So Oklahoma is not alone in facing this barrage of bad bills. And it's not very organic. Most of the state legislatures, even on the Republican side, recognize these are all very dumb ideas. But they fear the NRA to such an extent that if it comes up for a vote, they feel they have to vote for it. And so they typically try to kill it in committee or just let it slide under the radar so they don't get their NRA rating knocked down. Yes?
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know the difference between license and permit.
So it's basically the same thing in Oklahoma at least.
Okay.
Like in some states, if you have a permit, it can be kind of like a driver's license, and it's a permit to purchase a handgun. Well, in Oklahoma, it's either a permit or just a license to be able to concealed or open carry. So it's basically the same thing here.
Thank you.
All right. Now there's 2 specific subgroups I'd like to talk about who are disproportionately affected by gun violence. That's women and children. Let's start with the ladies. So guns make domestic violence and just overall situations much worse. So, for example, more than twice as many women are killed with a gun used by their husbands or intimate acquaintances, so boyfriends, basically. They're murdered by strangers using any other means, so gun, knife, whatever. So the danger's coming from inside the household, not some stranger stalking somebody down the street late at night. It's the people they know that are the most danger. And high gun states, so states that have a high percentage of people who own firearms, female gun homicides are 3.5 times higher than low gun states. Gun suicides are 6 times higher, and accidental gun deaths are 7 times higher. So there's a significant difference between those states that have lots of guns and those that have very few. And if you look at an international comparison, high-income countries, so countries like Western Europe, and you can throw in Japan and a few other Asian countries that have very high incomes in there. The U.S. accounts for 90% of women killed by guns in those countries. And we only have, I think it's less than 40% of the female population of those countries. Domestic violence. So guns have a lethality factor to them, and it greatly increases the risk of dying. So 554 American women are fatally shot by romantic partners every year. So that's 1 every 16 hours. And domestic abuse, which is what most often leads to these situations, a gun turns that more deadly by a factor of 5, and then family and infant assaults involving firearms are 12 times more likely to result in death than those by using other weapons. So it makes guns are significantly more lethal than other means. So even if an abuser were to still abuse with another weapon, it's less likely the woman would be killed by that, and she might have an opportunity to escape from that situation with a gun that doesn't happen too frequently. Guns and children. In the developed world, so basically high-income nations, same as the 90% figure a couple slides ago, children are 17 times more likely to be murdered by firearms. The U.S. represents 75% of child murder victims. That's overall murders, incidentally, not just with guns. And they're 9 times more likely to die from a gun accident than in other high-income developed countries. Children under 18, not including suicides here. So if you include suicides, this would jump to around 2,000 plus. 756 American children have been killed by gunfire. That was just in 2015. And toddlers, a toddler in America shoots someone about once a week. Most oftentimes, it's themselves, but a few cases, so about 15 here, they shot somebody else. I mean, and this is like 3 years old and younger here. No business being around a gun, yet this happens. So now I want to turn to the myth portion. And I've kind of reorganized this a bit, but there's 2 major myths I've seen that basically form the basis of NRA and gun lobby talking points. So the first is all about defensive gun use, being able to use a gun to protect yourself against somebody who's threatening. And this myth is divided into 3 parts. So there's the whole more guns, less crime hypothesis, that there's millions of defensive gun uses every year. That's a natural argument. And just overall that guns make you safer. So let's look at the more guns, less crime hypothesis. The one thing the NRA does really well, other than lobbying, is creating graphics. And this graphic is pretty clear. Violent crime rate going down, number of new guns going up. Now part of the problem here with this graphic is that they're measuring the number of new guns, but people can own more than one gun. It's not really a factor of whether you own one gun or several hundred guns. It's just the fact that you own one. And if you look at gun ownership over the same period, it goes kind of like this. And the reason for that is fewer and fewer people are buying more and more guns. They're becoming super collectors of guns. And until recently, guns were a great investment. And every time a Democrat talked about guns, gun prices would go up. And so people would be hoarding all these AR-15s, A, because they like guns, and B, the value kept going up on them. Well, the value kind of crashed after Donald Trump. What a few good things that's occurred. But yeah, so this graphic is very deceptive just at the very beginning due to measuring the number of guns, not the gun ownership rate, which has actually decreased during this period. So where did the more guns, less crime hypothesis come from? So there's this study in 1996 by John Lott and David Mustard talking about crime deterrence and right to carry concealed handguns. So basically looked at states that had passed concealed carry laws from 1970 or so to 1992. And they found that if all states had adopted shall issue laws, which means that if you aren't a felon, so if you can pass a background check and you go through the minimum training required, you can carry a handgun concealed. Police can't stop you. So if states had adopted these laws, they estimated that 1,500 murders, 4,000 rapes, 11,000 robberies, and 60,000 aggravated assaults would be avoided every year. Sounds pretty impressive. And then John Lott turned this study into the book More Guns, Less Crime, and he instantly became a celebrity on the right. I mean, because this was the first time that a major economist had, or anybody who studied this, had found that more guns had a significant positive effect on public health. And of course, this was very controversial, and a war of studies commenced on the effect of right to carry laws. All of a sudden became a very popular area to study. And so what did these studies find? Well, as more data came out and better academic methods were used to examine the data, no support was really found for the more guns, less crime hypothesis. And this was a 16-member panel that was convened to study guns overall, and they dedicated an entire chapter. It was like a 200 to 300 page book of just statistics on more guns, less crime, and whether right to carry laws reduce crime. And by a vote of 15-1, they found no evidence that guns reduce really any crimes. There's one dissent on that panel, and he felt that guns might reduce murders. However, about 7 years later, another study was conducted, basically examining the NRC panel, and it found that there were mistakes in this panel's decision. Not because, and most of these mistakes were not because of what the panel did, but because they were following John Lott's model too closely. Because they were trying to figure out, like, all right, according to John Lott's model, is this the case or not? And so when these errors were corrected, they actually found that there was statistically significant increases in aggravated assaults when right to carry laws were passed. And they were finding increases in other crimes as well. So basically, not only was John Lott wrong, it was the reverse. Right to carry laws were associated with an increase in crime. And so, and this doesn't even get into what John Lott has actually done since then. So he started off, I guess, as an honest academic, but he quickly fell from grace after that. He fabricated a large survey on defensive gun use. He completely made it up. He couldn't provide a shred of evidence that he had actually conducted it, other than some people said he had conducted it in the year he said he did. But he could provide no other proof. And they weren't saying it at the time, it was only years after they were like, oh yeah, John Lott told me he conducted that study. And he was using that as proof that he had in fact done it. Yes?
But he wasn't actually conducting a study, right? He wasn't actually studying statistics. He was going on the premise that this would be the case. But it wasn't as though he was actually investigating or speaking to people or getting statistics.
Right, so he did conduct the right to carry study, but this was a different study on defensive gun use. So basically it was supposed to be a survey of around 2,000 people, but he never talked to those people. And so he basically made up the statistic that 98% of all defensive gun uses merely involve brandishing a gun and not firing. And so people were wondering, where'd you get the statistic? Because at first he was citing it as the work of others. But they said, no, it's a study I conducted. I was like, all right, can we see that study? Well, I don't have the data. Well, where is the data? It was lost in a computer crash. So, and there's like, all right, well, there's other paperwork that has to go along with this. He's like, no, that's all been lost in an office move. So he could provide no evidence of doing this survey. And later on he was like, oh, it's just a small statistic and everything, so it really didn't matter anyway. But I did do it, and nobody's been able to find any evidence that he did do it. So he's simply lying there. He's presented faulty regressions on multiple occasions. So like he'll be asked to bring his work to some sort of panel on guns and discuss it, and they'll find like, hey, this regression, these models don't add up. And so it's like, oh, there's a mistake here, here, and here. And usually when those mistakes are corrected, the results disappear. And that's happened in a couple of cases. One of the more amusing things he's done is created Mary Rosh, an online sock puppet, to defend himself. So this was back when blogging was actually a big deal in the internet. And so academics were criticizing his work through blogs. And so this woman, Mary Roche, appeared and would fiercely defend his work. And she claimed to be a former student of his and said that, like, the classes she took with him were the best classes ever, best professor she ever had. And she would even tell people, download his work. And eventually it was found out by one of John Lott's own colleagues at a think tank that he was in fact Mary Roche. So no wonder he liked himself so much. So he's also invented fake statistics on multiple occasions. I've caught several of these. He's got lots of them out there. And he's lied about other statistics and much more.
Be that as it may, I bet he makes a lot more money than you do.
Maybe. So he's actually been basically been booted by academia. Yeah, so that's good, but he's created his own research center, the Crime Prevention Research Center, and it's funded by large donors. We don't know who those donors are. I've tried to pierce the veil there unsuccessfully. We just know his organization has, I think, it's several $100,000 in the bank, but yeah. And yet with this history, and even more recently, so I created this graphic a couple years ago. More recently, I found out that I'd actually written this article where I was citing a study he had conducted and said it had been published in an economics journal. I just assumed, well, all right, he's not going to lie about that, surely. So I cited it as appearing in this economics journal. Well, I get an email from the editor about a year or so later. It's like, hey, you wrote this article, but this paper never appeared. And look, here's the PDF, it's not there. So I was like, oh, really? And so it turned out he had just lied about being published in this journal. And later on he said he was just mistaken. He had forgotten to mention that he actually hadn't been published there. So, yeah. So if you encounter somebody referencing the great work of John Lott, this is who they're talking about. Moving on to millions of defensive gun uses every year. The ultimate bumper sticker slogan. And it's definitely related with more guns, less crime as well, though by a different academic. So this came from a 1992 survey by Gary Gluck and Mark Gertz. They surveyed 5,000 individuals. They found around 66 defensive gun uses out of that 5,000, which extrapolates to around 2.5 million defensive gun uses on an annual basis. And surprisingly enough, this estimate was in line with other similar surveys around this size. So it wasn't like they were inventing a survey or doing something really weird in that survey. They were following the proper techniques and everything, and we're finding this number, which sounds implausibly high. And this was contradicted by National Crime Victimization Survey data that only found around 100,000 defensive gun uses on an annual basis. And they survey around 90,000 households or so. So what was going on? There's a major discrepancy here. And so, as it turns out, what's happening here is that there's an inherent problem with surveying rare events. So 2.5 million may not sound like a rare event, but when taken in context of the American population, 300 million plus, it's a tiny fraction. Less than 1% of adults are experiencing a defensive gun use each year, even according to the 2.5 million number. So when small fractions like that occur in a survey, very weird stuff can happen. So people who think it looks good to say they had defensive gun use. So an interviewer calls up and say, did you have a defensive gun use? And he's like, well, yes, I did. It was quite heroic too. They want to look good. It may or may not be true. In fact, it most likely isn't true, but they say it anyway. And then as the interviewer asks more questions, oh yeah, it was in the dead of night. And I was going down this dark alleyway. And so they come up with this story afterwards to justify what they initially said. People just flat out lie on it. I mean, this is 1% of the population we're talking about. And telescoping as well. So that's when you remember a real event that occurred longer than a year or so ago. Because they were asking in the past year, have you had this happen? And they're like, yes, I did, but it occurred like 10 years ago, in fact. And so they just honestly forget that difference. And so all sorts of these factors, which in a normal survey wouldn't be a big deal, because you'll have these people who are basically false positives, which means they didn't have the incident happen to them, but they say they did. In a typical survey, that's typically counterbalanced by false negatives, which basically means it did occur to them, but they said, no, it didn't. But whenever it's a rare event, it's far more likely for somebody to be a false positive than a false negative. There's more people who it hasn't happened to than it has happened to. And so when you have that sort of discrepancy in the numbers, you get wildly inflated results. Another thing is that more than half of these reported incidents were likely illegal by their own description. So it's like, yeah, so I saw some guy in a hoodie come and so I drew my gun on him and he ran away. Well, that's assault with a lethal weapon. Like, there's no deadly encounter that was going to happen there. And so there's actually this one incident in Arizona I saw where this guy was bragging in like this small group for a neighborhood. It's like, yeah, I saw these two hoodlums breaking into like the power breakers and stuff. So I fired a couple shots at them and off they ran. Well, that's illegal. You aren't allowed to just go shoot somebody, even if they're doing something illegal like that. And so my guess is, had he been interviewed in such a survey, he would have said, well, yes, it was a legitimate defensive gun use. And yet it clearly wasn't. So even if this 2.5 million number was true, which it isn't, it would mean that there's millions of gun crimes occurring every year by supposedly law-abiding citizens. So it's not entirely clear why pro-gun people would want this statistic to be true, because it says a lot of bad stuff about gun owners. And also, there's no supporting empirical evidence. So usually, to determine whether a survey is telling the truth or not, you're able to compare it to like some sort of measure. So for example, you conduct a survey and ask like, how many people are subscribed to Sports Illustrated or something like that. And you'll get a number. And then you can compare it to the actual subscription rate. And you'll find, wow, that's wildly inflated. Or with crime stats, you can compare it to like what the FBI has and say like, oh, well, that's in line where it's inflated. Well, there's no supporting empirical evidence for this number of defensive gun uses. In fact, the Gun Violence Archive tries to track verified defensive gun uses, meaning somebody had defensive gun use, it was reported to the police. And if your life is in danger enough to where you're going to pull a gun, if you're a responsible citizen, you're going to report that incident to the police. Because either you felt your life was in danger, therefore a dangerous criminal was out there. And if you don't report it, that either means your life really wasn't in danger, which means you committed a crime, or your life was in danger, but you figured, nah, other people will deal with it. So you're irresponsible. And so with verified defensive gun uses, you're able to find like basically usually cases of responsible defensive gun uses. Now, some of these cases are also like gang members duking it out. And so it's defensive gun use in name only. But even then, there's around 1,600. That was in 2014. In 2015, it was less than that. And then in 2016, there's actually a spike above that. But still, nowhere near 2.5 million. And if you look at this graph, each of these little dots is actually a gun, representing 1,000 defensive gun uses. So this is what 2.5 million would look like. Here's where 1,600 is. So there's a massive discrepancy, and basically shows we cannot trust the surveys whatsoever. I mean, if there's no empirical evidence to back it, you basically have to assume that all these biases that are inherent in almost all surveys are happening here. So there's simply no good evidence that there's widespread defensive gun use. And here's how I look at it in context of the number of people who are shot per year, which is estimated by the CDC. 1,600 defensive gun uses versus the number of people shot. And that's not including the number of people who are bullied or intimidated with guns. And for example, an estimated 4.5 million women are bullied with a gun every year. That doesn't show up here unless they're shot. So there's far more negative uses of guns than positive ones. Yes?
I have a question. On the 118,000 people that are shot every year, does that include the police shooting people? Or is that just
Yes.
ordinary people shooting?
Yeah, this includes all people shot, including suicides.
So the
So
1,600 as well?
the 1,600 does not include police, so this is just civilians using a gun in self-defense. And possibly off-duty cops, but definitely not police officers on the job. Because if you include police officers on the job, then there would be significantly more defensive gun uses. And because there's, I think, more than 2,000 or so shot, police shoot in each year. So the defensive gun use, if you included those, would significantly go up. But this is talking about private civilians defending themselves with firearms. Because the whole NRA argument is that police aren't going to be everywhere at once, so you need the gun to defend yourself. And if we look at this next section, that the idea that guns make you safer, well, that's simply not the case. So having a gun in the home doubles the risk of homicide, triples it of suicide. And this actually isn't one study, it's a meta-analysis of 16 studies, which basically means the authors looked at 16 studies, reanalyzed the numbers, and came up with this estimate overall. So this is a very substantial figure. And for every time a gun was fired in self-defense, 3 unintentional shootings, 7 criminal assaults or homicides, 11 attempted or completed suicides. Again, multiple studies, not just one by Kellerman, which many gun advocates will try to claim, are showing around about these same numbers. So if multiple studies are showing something, you can take it with a lot more credibility. If it's just one study showing something, you won't wait till there's more studies coming out that show roughly the same thing, or disprove it. Also, it's the people you know, because one of the typical gun advocate fantasy is basically you're out walking and a stranger attacks you, and you only have a couple seconds to act. Well, the overwhelming majority of these times, it's a non-stranger, so it's somebody you know, are probably less likely to suspect. So for every 1% increase in gun ownership, there's a 0.9% increase in non-stranger homicide. So the people you know killing you. And there's only a small, insignificant increase in stranger homicides. So really the whole gun debate comes down to the people you know, not protecting yourself from strangers. And also, even when you have a situation where you need to defend yourself, having a gun in that very rare circumstance isn't all that much more beneficial than other means of self-defense. Now this comes from the NCVS survey. I talked about inherent problems with surveys, but this is the only data we have to look at this question, and really the only way we can answer it. So using this data, doing nothing when you're attacked has about 11% injury rate, is as effective as a defensive gun use with a 10.9% injury rate. So basically, just standing there doing nothing is going to prevent injury about as much as wielding a gun. One of these 2 studies that looked at these surveys found that any weapon other than a gun reduces injury after wielding it. So basically, a person comes into your home, you grab the lamp and throw it at them. That's more effective at preventing injury after doing that action than a gun. So when people say, you have to have a gun for self-defense, no, there's lots of other mechanisms. And with this one survey, or one study based on the survey, any of those choices is going to be a better option than wielding a gun. Running away or calling the police is safer. Just taking the coward's way out. Less likely to be injured. The only statistical benefit of using a gun in self-defense comes before taking the defensive action, which is kind of a, huh? So basically what these studies did is they looked at the injury rate before you took the action and then after you took the action. So apparently, like, wielding a gun in self-defense significantly improves your odds at not getting injured before you use the gun for self-defense, which doesn't make much sense. And there's two explanations for it. One is that gun owners tend to be ninjas, which means they have great reflexes, so if somebody's going to attack them, they're able to leap out of the way, then deploy the gun. So they're able to avoid injury in the initial attack, and then get their gun out and then use the firearm. The other explanation, which I find far more plausible and corresponds with a lot more of the research on the subject, is that the situations where you're going to use a gun in self-defense are significantly different than other situations where you wouldn't. A lot of these actions occur very quickly. So it's just like the person's upon you, bam, the instant's over. And almost always there's not enough time to pull a gun in that sort of situation. And it may seem like a very quick action, but the average person, actually, even with somebody with a little training, can deploy a gun that's concealed in around 2 seconds, which that sounds pretty fast. However, I can get from here to about the second to third row in about 2 seconds. It's about 20 feet. So if somebody's within 20 feet of you and basically rushing at you, you don't have time to pull the gun, especially if it's concealed, safety's on, you're carrying it responsibly and whatever. So, and most of these incidents are going to occur a lot closer than 20 feet. Like the person's going to be right on you. Like not all things occur in an alley. You're going to be surprised and whatever. So there's just no opportunity to draw the gun. However, in situations where there's an escalating argument, so you're in a heated discussion with somebody, you start to feel threatened and pull the gun preemptively. Well, you're going to have more time to do that because that other person's probably just as surprised that you're pulling the gun. So it comes down to like an escalating situation where you're able to pull the gun rather than like a sneak attack. And that probably explains why the difference in injury before you take the action is so different. When you aren't pulling a gun, it's going to be a surprise attack, so you get injured before you can do anything. In an escalating argument, you're able to pull the gun without getting injured because they're just arguing with you. So that's the typical explanation for why that's the case. But after you deploy the gun, it's no more effective than anything else.
If you pulled the gun, how is it a defensive use?
So basically, if you're in fear of bodily harm, so like this argument's getting heated and the other person's getting animated and threatening, you can pull a gun and get away with saying that, like, hey, I was in fear of my life here. And a jury's likely going to buy that.
Depending on what compass we are.
Right. Yeah. Well, in most states as well. I mean, yeah. I mean, if you fear for your life in such a situation, you can be justified taking defensive action like that.
Like in the Trayvon Martin case.
Yeah. I mean, even in that case where basically he chases him down and then gets
But he was in
attacked.
fear of his life.
Yeah, and I mean, there is evidence that Trayvon was wailing on him, but that was after he confronted him.
But
Yes.
wouldn't you say Trayvon Martin was standing his ground?
Yes.
So I don't understand how that guy who chased him down can use that defense, and they couldn't have said in that trial that Trayvon was standing his ground.
Right. But if you're both standing your ground, technically,
Presumably
you're
others.
both legally in the right there. It's a really weird legal area that makes no
There's no
sense when it comes to
requirement.
But a lot of stuff.
There's no requirement that if you're armed, you must retreat from the situation.
Right. Yeah,
There's no
states,
requirement that says you have to back away or find other methods before you deploy or anything else.
yeah, so in states without stand your ground, basically the requirement is unless you can't safely retreat, you must retreat. Well, with stand your ground, it's basically like, I'm here, I'm in my legal rights to be here,
With my-
and so I can go ahead and draw. And while a lot of conservatives like to say that, like, well, stand your ground really didn't influence the Trayvon Martin trial. If you look at the jury instructions, they're completely different from what you would see in a state without stand your ground. And it really comes down to, you don't even really have to have a rational basis per se for invoking the stand your ground right to self-defense. It's just like, I feared for my life. Even if that fear was relatively irrational, it's still a fear that sort of justifies it. So you almost have to take the person at their word. So it's just a really awkward legal area.
Yeah, well, I mean, they decided at the time not to arrest him.
Right.
You know, and they decided this morning to arrest the guy who said it was self-defense this morning, so you have to take that into account too. You know, he wasn't arrested or even anything until the people started organizing there. And then he was arrested, then he was charged, whereas this morning, they charged the guy, or they didn't charge him, but they held him for first degree murder because they didn't believe his story about self-defense,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
That's still the story. So that's gonna change all that too, so.
Yeah, and it comes down to a lot to whether the police officer believes the
Right.
guy or not. And
Right.
so there's all sorts of really just weird legal stuff that goes on with it that just isn't good, and also tends to promote a shoot first type of mentality. And there's been several studies now that have come out and shown that where stand your ground laws are passed, homicides increase. And also people claiming legitimate self-defense also increases too. All right. The other main fallacy that is the centerpiece of most gun lobby talking points is criminals don't follow laws because they're criminals. That's what they do. And so, and then there's this great meme that's floating around. But really, when you think about it, if your whole justification for not having law is that criminals won't follow it, why have any laws then? Because that's what, the definition of criminal is. They aren't going to follow it, and if you want a 100% success rate, people following the law, it's not going to happen. So it's basically just a prescription for anarchy. And the fact is that criminals do follow some laws. It does influence behavior. So if I'm a criminal driving down the street and I see a red stoplight, I don't think, my gosh, I'm a criminal, I have to run that stoplight. No, I'm most likely going to follow the law, put on the brakes, and stop there. Just because you're breaking one law doesn't mean you have to break all the laws. And laws do affect criminal behavior. So, if it's tougher to get a gun, more expensive to get a gun, they're less likely to get that gun. For example, in Japan, many of the major gangs there have stockpiles of guns. They never use them. Why is that? Well, because if one gang member gets caught killing somebody with a gun, they can arrest the entire gang for that same crime and put them all in prison. So the gangs there have very strict rules. You will not use guns. So it affected criminal behavior. Now you can argue about whether that law is a bit too extreme or not, but it's a good case of showing that laws do influence behavior, even criminal behavior. And so if you have the right laws, you should be able to influence that behavior. And here comes the Chicago, and it's this whole idea, well, gun laws don't work, right? Because there's all sorts of criminals and they murder everybody. Number one in murder and gang violence. Yeah. And of course, if the Donald tweets it, as he recently did, the horrible carnage, it must be true. And Chicago does have a problem, but it's not as big as several other cities. Chicago has seen a spike in the recent year, in 2016. It's in 8th place. But St. Louis is way out here, that's 59.3 versus 27.9 per 100,000. And these are murders. Baltimore, Detroit, New Orleans. So there's all these cities that have around the same homicide problem there. Yes?
That's metro area, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even if you like move it out to include like neighborhoods or just narrow it down to the city proper, it still holds. Chicago's around 8th in recent years. And if you use a 5-year average, so just basically smoothing out the lines, Chicago's not as bad there because the spike just occurred last year. And we're not sure whether it's part of a larger trend or not. That'd take multiple years to find out. And you look here, Detroit, St. Louis, New Orleans, all up here. And look, yeah, there's Tulsa. Tulsa made the list. And there is evidence that the situation in Chicago would be much worse without the relatively strict gun laws it has. So for example, ammunition is a whole lot more expensive than it would be otherwise there.
But they're going to Indiana and Wisconsin and so forth to buy
Right.
ammunition.
Yes, but that increases the cost as well because they go there and then they have to buy them on the street from the guys who went there, and so of course they're marking up the prices and everything. But if you had cheaper ammunition, you'd be buying a lot more of it. So that's one way. Another way is that the time to crime, so when they find a gun at a crime scene, there's a time to crime. So when it was initially sold in a gun store to when it appears at a crime scene. For Chicago, that's 11.6 years, which is higher than the national average, which is a good thing. Because that means that there aren't as many gun stores like selling guns directly to criminals. Instead, they're having to get it from elsewhere, from somebody who stole it from somebody who then sold it to somebody. And so it's this long chain to get the gun to Chicago, which is then used in the crime. Instead of just going to the store, buying the gun, immediately going to the street and shooting people with it. So a higher time to crime is a positive. Whereas, like, if you had a lower time to crime, that would mean more people are directly getting the guns and instantly using them. And Dr. Philip Cook, who's an expert in the field, told me in an interview that if guns and ammunition were more readily available, he's convinced that there'd be even more shootings. And I'm going to go back a slide real quick. Remember these 3 cities, Detroit, St. Louis, New Orleans. What do they all have in common? They're all prohibited by state law from enacting any new gun ordinances. So preemption, which is what Oklahoma's looking at doing. Yes. Yeah, so now cities would have to pay a penalty. But these 3 cities, the top 3 in terms of violence, can't really do anything to help their situation. And both New Orleans and St. Louis are in states with basically F ratings when it comes to gun laws. They have really awful gun laws, especially Louisiana. And Detroit, their gun laws aren't quite as bad as these 2, but are still pretty bad. So gun laws do have a significant impact.
What does the NRA say to that?
Oh, they don't get this far.
They don't understand that.
They usually stop at Chicago. Oh, and occasionally they'll claim like, well, it's all Democratic mayors and stuff. It's like, well, you're a mayor but can't do anything about the situation by law. Like, there's nothing, your hands are tied, it doesn't matter which party you're from there. Yes?
I'm confused, so you're saying these cities, they can't do anything to do?
They can't pass their own gun laws.
Because the states are. have-
Right. Yeah, so these cities are in states that prevent them from enacting their own gun ordinances.
It's like the laws here in Oklahoma that prevent cities from saying no fracking in our
Yeah.
city.
Yeah. Yeah, so in this case, it's just no gun laws.
Exactly.
Yes.
Forgive me if I'm getting ahead of you and this is coming up, but do you have any information about the bad apple gun dealers in Chicago?
Yes, so there are, I don't have it on the slides, but there are a couple of those. One of them in particular, like, it keeps recreating itself in a way. And so a good portion of the guns that hit the streets are from those, but many others are stolen, basically. So there's an estimated 200,000 to 500,000. Yes, that's a wide range. The 200,000 comes from the FBI, the 500,000 comes from a recent survey out of Harvard. Around 200,000 to 500,000 guns each year in the US are stolen. So that's a lot of guns in the black and gray market that criminals can easily access. So many of the guns they get are from those thefts. Now there are the bad apple gun dealers as well, and that's an important problem to fix, but it's not the largest problem there. Yeah, and also that reminds me of this funny anecdote. Funny. So, yeah. So the ATF tracks guns that are stolen from stores. Well, they track the ones that the stores decide to tell them about because the ATF is severely undermanned, under budget, and they can't inspect all these stores. And so this one year, they inspect this one store in Arkansas that they've been hearing complaints about. And the store's like, oh yeah, we lost a lot of guns recently that we didn't tell you about. And so the entire state of Arkansas, their number of gun thefts from gun stores jumped like 100% or so, simply because this one store was like, oh yeah, we did lose some. And so it's really not tracked all that well. And so just the thefts and losing guns stuff is a significant problem. And so it's not just bad apple gun dealers, but there's probably a lot of other ones that we simply don't know about. Now, is it all the gun stores? No. Even most of them? Probably no. That's a significant enough fraction to where it can be a concern. The other one, gun-free zones are to blame. So criminals don't, they just look at the sign on the building and go, aha, I shall strike here because nobody has a gun. Well, if they do that, they're really bad at it because 16 of 33 mass public shootings from 2009 to 2015 occurred in an area where guns were allowed by law. So if they are trying to find these places where guns aren't allowed, they just suck at it. And also, most mass shootings occur because like the shooter has some sort of personal relationship with the space. Either he knows somebody there and wants to kill them, or just has bad memories of that place and wants to enact carnage at that space. They aren't thinking that, wow, all right, so of all the public areas I know of in the area, which ones don't allow guns, and going through it in a scientific fashion. Like the closest one to that case is the Aurora shooter. But even that theater he chose due to good parking. Like he actually writes in his journal, he's concerned about finding a parking spot. And he never once mentions civilians carrying guns, or whether the area was a gun-free zone or not. So even the one shooter where we have significant documentation of what his plans were, there's no evidence of it there. And even in San Bernardino, which is also pointed to as a case where the shooter was strategically choosing his location. He only mentions police officers. Not once does he mention civilians carrying firearms. So this idea that there are these rational actors seeking to maximize casualties and in order to do that are choosing places that don't allow guns simply isn't true. And even when armed civilians are there, they aren't all that effective. So from 2000 to 2013, only one active shooting out of 160 was stopped by an armed civilian.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
What is the definition of a mass public shooting?
So mass public shooting, so
I
there's
know
actually
mass
several.
shooting, but I don't know mass public.
So there's multiple definitions. I'm actually being rather loose with it. So a mass killing is 4 or more people killed.
Right.
Many people take mass shooting to be 4 or more people killed with a gun.
Right.
Now there's an alternative definition to that I'll get to in a moment. A mass public shooting under that definition would be 4 or more people killed with a gun in a public area, so not a private home. Now another definition of mass shooting is 4 or more people shot.
Right.
And when you do that, the numbers significantly increase.
Right.
And I actually
Well, they're
prefer
able.
the 4 or more people shot simply because the 4 or more people killed is already a definition.
Right.
But it's open to debate and you'll see
Well,
both
but
numbers.
It's also more effective at showing exactly how often people are really shot. Too.
Right.
Like in instances where you think this guy, and yes, I'm being general here, this guy kills his family, and maybe that's only 2 people he shot. But in several instances, and it's because I saw Independent Lens last night, and it was the Texas shooter, the end of, at the tower, and he had killed his wife and brother first, and then he went on to commit this mass shooting, and of course that was a mass public shooting that people will think about.
Right.
But like, yeah, the FBI, I think it is, or whatever, has one that's 4 people shot or whatever, and they have a list that you can't even. I tried to get through it one day, I couldn't even get through a whole year. That's how long it was.
So the gun violence
So
archive.
it wasn't deaths, it was just literally people shot.
Yes.
You know, but in one instance, by
Right.
whatever, that they considered to be part of one instance. And yeah, sometimes they have to amend that a little bit and say, well, they went directly from murdering, like in Sandy Hook, his mother, to murdering that, to the mass murder that was public or semi-public. So I just wondered what the mass public shooting was here. That's all I
Yeah. So this,
Okay.
for this one, it's read mass killing.
Okay.
But, so the gun violence archive tracks mass shootings with the 4 or more people shot, and that's more than 300 per year. If you use this, it's several per year. And then you can also parse it to exclude gang shootings and
Right.
shootings that are the result of robbery, so it gets into this whole morass of stuff. So I typically prefer the definition where 4 or more people are shot, just period. It keeps it simple, and
Right.
also, like, with many of these, what keeps something from being a mass killing is often like a matter of centimeters. Like, it's just pure luck. So like you'll have a situation where 18 people are shot and nobody's killed. And so it's like, oh, no big deal, that's not a mass
But-
shooting. Yeah, it should be
I mean, you don't
included
know
in the mass
anybody who was
shooting.
ever shot.
Yeah, there's so many, yeah, it was just a bad
It's no
shot.
big deal. But I mean, it's no big deal. Do you know any victims of gun violence?
Yeah,
It's not no big deal. Just,
Right.
I mean, it's medical bills, it's not her walking again, it's stuff like that.
yeah.
That's not nothing, you know, I mean,
Right.
it's not death, but it is a factor.
Yes. Go
Do
ahead.
they know how many people are shot each year by strangers trying to help with their guns?
So it's not all that many because defensive gun uses tend to be rare as to begin with. There are definitely cases, like there's one, it's either last year or the year before I recall, where 2 robbers were trying to steal this guy's truck. Good Samaritan comes along, fires some shots hits the guy whose truck was being stolen in the head, completely missing the two robbers. And then on top of that, there's several dozen cases each year where like somebody hears a noise in their home, goes down with a gun, fires, and it's their cousin or family member. So there's those situations as well. They aren't all that prevalent, but they're definitely a thing. And it's not being tracked all that well currently. I know the Gun Violence Archive has those statistics. I'm not sure if they have it parsed out to that level where it's readily available. And you can do it, but you have to go through a lot of data. All right. So I want to go through a few personal cases just to put a face on all these numbers I've been presenting so far. So first one is Jessie. She was at the Aurora Theater July 20th, 2012, seeing the premiere of The Dark Knight Rises. She had actually narrowly escaped a Toronto shooting the previous month. Like she had gotten out just minutes before that shooting occurred. She was 24 years old at the time, 1 year younger than I am. She was an aspiring sportscaster, and according to her mother, was an absolutely beautiful writer. Was just full of life, feisty but very kind-hearted. So that night was the Aurora shooting. 12 dead, including Jessie. 70 injured. The shooter, in this case, was able to obtain more than 160 pounds, so that's thousands of rounds of ammo, online without background check. And in his journal, he actually mentions, puts a little note to himself, like, research gun laws around mental health, because he knew he had significant psychiatric problems. He wanted to make sure he wasn't raising any red flags. And of course he wasn't, because of our state of gun laws. And actually talking with Jessie's mother, apparently good guys with guns were there. Even though it's technically a gun-free zone, there's an off-duty police officer, and there's several others who would have definitely been armed. But they made no difference, and could make no difference. The guy came in with tear gas grenades and started firing with a Bushman, or an AR-15 style rifle. It was dark, chaotic, people were running everywhere. And so, like, Jessie's friend was there with her at the time, and he had a concealed carry license. He wasn't carrying that night. And so Jessie's mom asked him, like, if you had been carrying a gun, could you have stopped it? And he's like, no, I probably would have shot more people, because there's just no way to aim accurately. And even if he could, the shooter was in full tactical gear, body armor. So a bullet from a handgun wouldn't have pierced that. He would have just revealed his position and been killed as well. Kate. So this was November 2012. Kate had been separated from her husband for almost 2 years, the January 2011, after he had physically abused her. She was trying to file for a divorce, but it just kept dragging on. And so she had moved to a different apartment. Didn't think her husband knew about this apartment. But he showed up one day. Her father was there at the time. They tried to hold the door closed because they thought he was just trying to barge in and force a confrontation to talk about the divorce and everything. Then all of a sudden, shots were fired through the door at center mass, meaning he was aiming for the chest, down. They were surprised by this. They fell back. They didn't even know he had a gun at the time. And so he shot both of them a couple times. Kate was telling me about what little she remembers. She just remembers her right hand, which she had moved up in like a defensive motion, exploding because the guy had hollow point bullets. He shot her twice. He shot her father twice, and then basically held them there for 20 minutes, almost as hostages. He finally let them get, finally let them go after that 20 minutes, but this entire time, her 4-year-old son was watching. Her husband had his guns taken from him in 2011. He had about like 10 or so, due to a temporary restraining order. But that order had lapsed. And even if that order was still up, it wouldn't have stopped him, because with Florida law, even though with a temporary restraining order they tend to seize the guns, the guy can go out and buy guns legally. Like, he doesn't even have to do it through a private sale or anything. He can legally buy a gun from a gun store. There's nothing legally stopping him, even with the restraining order. And afterwards, Kate fortunately survived, along with her father. They all suffer from PTSD now. And so many people tend to think of shootings and it's like it stops right at the act of shooting. The person either dies or injured. They don't realize the enduring trauma that goes on after that, not only to the survivors, but to the people around them. And one interesting note on this, her husband was an avid gun guy. He had lots of them, and she had actually seen him sell about half of his arsenal on Craigslist through private sales beforehand. It didn't raise any red flags to her at the time because she really didn't know much about gun violence. Last case.
What happened to the husband?
So finally, like 4 to 5 years afterwards, he's finally in jail. The trial just wrapped up just last week, I think it was. Yeah, so he had been postponing with his lawyer, and then finally he was found guilty on all 5 counts. There's a couple like assault with a deadly weapon, so forth, and so he's now comes the sentencing phase. But so even after all this time, it's still going on.
What kind of bullets did you say you used?
Hollow point. So basically, hollow points are bullets that expand after impact, and they're actually, I believe, banned by the Geneva Convention for use in warfare, because hollow points are used for their stopping power, because if you have just like a typical solid point or whatever, oftentimes it'll go through the person. A hollow point expands to where it just stays in the body, inflicting as much.
Like an anchor you put in the wall.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's the main difference in the ammunition types there.
And also Pierce,
Pierce body armor.
but,
Yeah. Armor. Yeah, so there's, solid points are typically better for that, though if it's close enough range, it's not going to matter. But hollow points,
Was it legal to be sold?
oh yeah, hollow points are,
They're not legal
Very-
in the military, but they're
Right.
legal on our
Streets of
Oh,
America.
you're
Yes.
kidding? Really?
yeah. And finally, Joshua. At Jewish Community Center, Los Angeles, 1999. He was 6 years old at the time. He was there for a summer camp. And this man who's a neo-Nazi, with history of mental illness and felony assault, apparently, it's unclear when the assault occurred, but it might have been when he was under psychiatric care. He was still able to obtain guns through straw purchase, private sale, basically all the loopholes he was able to get guns through. And then he was able to buy some guns apparently through a store, which I don't know how he was able to do that. He came in with an Uzi. He was specifically looking to kill Jews. And so the kids were coming in from recess, and he entered at that moment. Josh was towards the front of the line. And so in a matter of seconds, he fired 70 shots from his Uzi, submachine gun, just spraying indiscriminately. He shot 4 children and 1 adult. Fortunately, nobody was killed in that somehow. He did kill 1 other person at a different scene. And Joshua was shot in the leg twice, once near the hip, once lower. Apparently one of the bullets, the bullet that hit the hip, most people think that when a bullet hits, it just goes straight through. No. It migrated near his spine. Had gone like maybe a centimeter closer, he would have been paralyzed for life. And afterwards, there's several lawsuits against the companies because it turned out that at least one of his guns was like surplus, because the company had a deal with this police station or police department. Police department didn't want the guns anymore, so they just basically flooded them into gun stores with the knowledge that most likely some of them would filter onto the streets in various illegal ways. And so Joshua's mother and several others sued the manufacturer for creating a public nuisance, basically knowing that flooding the market with guns in such a way would lead to guys like this neo-Nazi getting them and using it to inflict carnage. However, this lawsuit dragged on, and finally in 2005, Congress passed the Protection of Lawful Firearms bill, PLACA, which basically means you can't sue a manufacturer for negligence. Now there's some exceptions, but those exceptions are very narrow, and this suit didn't apply, so they weren't able to get anything from the manufacturer.
What does CAA stand for? Protection Law?
I forget what the acronym.
No worries, okay.
Yeah, you can, it's PLACA.
Okay, PLACA.
You can,
Got it.
and also in terms of PLACA, going back to Jesse's case, her mom sued the online retailer of all that ammunition, not looking for any money, mind you, just for a change of policy and make sure they put background checks in place. Well, in Colorado, they have this law to where basically if you lose the case, you have to pay like the legal fees of the opponent. So her case was tossed out due to PLACA, and she was saddled with more than $100,000 worth of legal bills that she had to pay to the manufacturer of the bullets that killed her daughter. And she was forced to declare bankruptcy due to this.
Protection of lawful commerce and arm theft.
There it is. Yeah. So there's one really bad gun bill at the national level. So finally going to wrap up here. Why does GDP matter in the age of Trump? Because it seems like all sorts of progressive causes are under attack right now. So why choose gun violence prevention when there's so many other issues that seem to be at stake and pressing at the time, perhaps? Indeed, there's so many causes under attack. And it's going to be a bleak 4 years. We're going to be playing defense at the national level. In Oklahoma, we're always playing defense at the state level. But this defense does matter. I mean, bad gun bills cost lives, and good gun bills save lives. So through the advocacy, even indirectly, you will have the opportunity to save lives. Also, gun violence intersects with many other issues, like criminal justice reform, like making sure police don't have to assume that everybody they encounter is armed, and therefore fire first, even when it might not be justified, because they're scared. And quite frankly, with so many guns on the street, they're rightfully scared. The odds are the person they're encountering probably does have a gun, and they want to save their own lives. And this leads to their own biases playing out in a very lethal way. So keeping guns off the street can help solve that problem. And there's many other causes like this, where gun violence intersects with it and can help those other causes. And then also, throughout the next 4 years, providing an alternative vision to Trump's vision and the NRA's vision of America is going to be critical. It's just not enough to say no. We have to provide a reason for saying no and showing like how we can make the world a better place and why their path forward is actually a path backwards. So that's going to be key over the next 4 years. So what can you do? Well, you can stay informed, just being able to weed out fake news from real news and knowing what the facts are on this issue. Correct misconceptions, easy done. I find that personal conversations, even with the most ardent gun advocates, can often yield surprising results. Like they'll be like, oh wow, I didn't know that. Now it might not change their overall view of the problem, but it might help them realize that, oh wow, that bill really is bad. And so changing minds slowly, in-person conversations is possible.
Is this in person?
Yeah, in person. Yeah.
Maybe I've not
Online, good luck.
Yeah.
It's not likely to happen, but in person, yeah, people tend to be slightly more agreeable.
That correcting misconceptions in conversations that you've had, have you noticed whether or not you get a better result or you have those changing perceptions? Is there any difference in the age level of the people that you're talking to?
Say that last part.
Is there any difference in the age level of the person with whom you're having the discussion? Whether you actually get them to change a misconception?
So I actually haven't, which is kind of surprising because you think older people in general tend to be more certain in their views through
But they're
life
also
experience.
more likely to have had life experiences that may have changed their minds.
Right. Yeah, and when you've had experiences such as theirs that had changed your minds in that way, it's far harder to counter that. But I've actually found that many of these issues is just correcting simple misconceptions like, no, that's actually not the number here. It's this number.
Okay.
And like, no, we're not attacking responsible gun ownership here. We just want people to be responsible with their guns and making sure our laws help that rather than promote irresponsible gun ownership. Yes?
I had a personal experience at our booth that we put up for a festival in downtown Tulsa in the summertime. And a gentleman who had his wife and small child and his holster swaggered up to the booth with an attitude. He was ready to kind of take us all on. And I spoke to him calmly and explained to him what we were about and our gun safety program, teaching, and he's listening to me like, who knew? This is what they did. And then I explained to him that, you know, we were only in favor of kind of knowing where guns are, what you know, registration would mean, and he kept shaking his head up. Oh. And before he walked away, he signed our clipboard. And so it's changing the misconception, I think, sometimes. It was a wonderful experience, and we both were happy at the end of our conversation. So it's possible one-on-one, face-to-face can be quite effective.
I'd like to know why anybody thinks it's a good thing to allow mentally ill people to be able to buy guns. Why are they trying to do that? I just that doesn't make sense to me.
Right, so there's a couple parts to that. Like from a just civil rights perspective, I'd say, so mentally ill is a very broad category. And so most mentally ill people are not a threat to others.
Right, right.
And like, there really no statistically significant difference between them and the general population. There is, now some of the more severe ones, there is. I think schizophrenia is one of those.
There's still more
And
likely to be harmed themselves.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, suicide is a
And
big.
the House resolution that passed through the Senate today or yesterday is for those people who have filed the disability claim with Social Security that says, I have a severe mental illness and I'm disabled and need Social Security because of that. That it's keeping those people, are reporting those people and saying they can't have
Right.
guns.
Yeah, so. Go ahead.
Well, actually, I'm more along the cynical view that says the more guns you put into hands that shouldn't be holding them, the more shootings you're gonna have, and the more guns you're gonna sell.
Yes.
Well, actually, the biggest danger is to themselves.
Yeah.
The person that are most likely to shoot is themselves.
Right. Yeah, and even like with schizophrenics who do pose a slightly bigger danger to others than the general population, it's basically never strangers. It's always the caretaker, somebody else, and then usually followed by themselves. So you're right, there is a major suicide component to that, but most people on the pro-gun side don't even recognize suicides as really counting in the debate. They don't consider it gun violence. Basically, if somebody commits suicide, they're going to do it anyway with whatever means necessary. And that's not the case because guns are significantly more lethal than alternative means of suicide. And if a person survives the first suicide attempt, they almost never go on to try to commit suicide again. More questions? And the last thing on here is vote, but that's going to be a couple years.
Well, and even before that,